Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Widowers Organization monthly podcast, where we seek to provide grief support for those who have lost a spouse, partner, or any significant loved one. The NWO and the Men's Grief Network is a nonprofit group bringing men together in grief. Our organization is led by experts in loss, many of whom are widowers, and others who have grieved significant losses. The NWO offers free of charge resources, including articles, blogs, books, peer-to-peer support, and more to help men during this very difficult time and beyond. As men, we don't have to go through loss alone, whether it be the loss of a spouse, child, parent, friend, or sibling. Our topic tonight is get out of the tent, stepping into the woods. Living life within a box is not living a life. Taking chances after a death is not easy. Tonight's session will discuss opportunities that speak to metaphorically living life to the fullest, not passing through it. Tonight's educator, we're pleased to have Ben Wolfe. Ben is a grief, loss, and transition trainer and consultant. After 28 years as director and grief therapist at St. Mary's Medical Center's Grief Support Center in Duluth, Minnesota, where he provided life-threatening illness and bereavement counseling from any cause of death for all ages. Ben is also a past president of the International Association for Death Education and Counseling, an award-winning educator, a St. Mary's Medical Center's Employee of the Year, and an international consultant and presenter, having given over 2,000 presentations dealing with grief and loss. Additionally, for over 25 years, Ben taught university graduate courses on death and dying, and for 23 years also taught a course on life-threatening illness at the University of Minnesota Duluth School of Medicine. And I understand that Ben also bakes his own bread. So if any of you gentlemen out there are looking to start up a new pastime or continue in something you may have started along that line, Ben's the guy. And also Ben's recently back from what I understand was a wonderful trip to Italy.
Correct.
I'm NWO board member Ken Levy. And speaking of getting out of the tent, I lost my wife Sheila to inflammatory breast cancer around this time of year, and she was only 49. As a result, I found myself dreading autumn because it's just so evocative. For quite some time, there were what felt like a conspiracy of annual triggers that brought on feelings of grief and sadness. Not only did she pass in November, we got married this time of year, plus her birthday's in October. October is also Breast Cancer Awareness Month, with signs and posters everywhere. And on top of that, the days just get shorter. So it took me a long time to get out of the tent, especially around this time of year, as you say, Ben. So even though she passed quite a while ago, this coming November 3rd, it'll be 17 years. This time of year, as I say, is still very evocative to me in bringing up a lot of those triggers and kind of tends to make me very reflective. But my wife was incredibly strong and brave, and she faced 2 cancer diagnoses, one that was a stage 1, which unfortunately, 1 out of 8 women will get that bad news in their lifetime as far as getting a stage 1 diagnosis of breast cancer. And most of the time, it's a very survivable situation because of the treatments that they're currently promoting with the usual 3, which are colloquially known as cut, burn, and poison, but that means radiation therapy, lumpectomy or mastectomy, and chemotherapy. And of course, the chemotherapy treatments just keep getting better and better. So Sheila did really well. We had what I also refer to as our cancer year, where she underwent those 3 things. Particularly grueling, of course, was the chemo and the 6.5 weeks of radiation. Pretty much every day she had to go for that. But Sheila was not only strong and beautiful, she was also a New York City marathon runner. She ran 26.2 miles quite a few times, which always took my breath away that she was able to have that kind of stamina and that kind of determination and to have that kind of training and endurance and discipline. So I admire and love her still every minute, every day. Um, we thought, of course, after that cancer year was over, that we would put it behind us and we would come back to a semblance of a normal life slowly but surely. And thank goodness we did. We did quite a bit of traveling, and um, we were just getting back to enjoying life again. Sheila, of course, went for regular follow-up checkups, as one does, every 3 months, and then eventually it became every 6 months as a few years went past, and she was on a regimen of tamoxifen to keep the cancer away as a precaution. That I think has also been kind of superseded by some new drugs that came out after tamoxifen, which are more effective in preventing the recurrence of cancer. But even with all of those follow-up treatments and precautions and visits to her oncologist and her GP and really trying to stay on top of things, um, it was pretty much at that 5-year magic survival point where you're generally considered good to go, or as they say in the medical profession, NDE, I think it is, NED, I should say, which is no evidence of disease. So every cancer patient looks forward to getting that NED certification from their oncologist. So Sheila was in strong form, being her usual wonderful, beautiful self. But then she started 5 years at that magic survival mark, developing somewhat anomalous symptoms, which no doctor could quite figure out. Her arm swelled up, and it got very puffy, and it was thought to be lymphedema because Sheila had what's called a sentinel node biopsy. And those of you gentlemen who have dealt with breast cancer from your wives in that arena might be familiar with that procedure where they take out a couple of lymph nodes. It's pretty rare that that results in lymphedema, which is a swelling because the lymph fluid gets backed up because it's been surgically messed with, in for a good cause though. But she wasn't following the track of it being what would be thought of as typical lymphedema. So we went to a number of different specialists and doctors that she had um, been seeing, time tested, who couldn't quite figure out what it was. And again, this is like 5 years after the initial diagnosis of the stage 1. And she was then seen by somebody who actually finally suggested she get a PET scan. Um, why that wasn't suggested previously, I don't know, but that's another little kind of a burden that I carry. I wish that they had been on more proactive in that, getting her on a PET scan, and the PET scan showed that there was a return of the cancer. So that was quite a blow for us, to deal with that a second round, a second time. So it turned out it didn't really have a focal tumor as conventional breast cancers do, where they could either perform a lumpectomy and get clean margins surgically. So this was actually breast cancer that had obviously survived the initial treatment and went into her lymphatic system. So that's a tough one, because once things get into the circulatory system or get into the lymphatic system, it's free to the cancer cells roam in the body. And in Sheila's case, it went into her lungs, which was particularly horrible, cruel, as cancer is, because she was an athlete and she would run these 26.2 miles, and then suddenly she was winded and out of breath if she walked up the stairs to the front of our house. So that was kind of tough going, to say the least. It was really a very, very scary time. And I would say within about 4 or 5 months after the PET scan confirmed that she had a recurrence of the cancer in this particular form, known as inflammatory breast cancer, which is extremely aggressive and very difficult to treat. They threw a couple of different chemo drugs at her that were clinical, and some that were relatively new and out of the clinical trials, but pretty new. Uh, Nothing seemed to work. So Uh, to make a long story just a slight bit shorter, she passed away within about 4 months following the original confirmation of her recurrence. So I took that very hard. Obviously, Sheila and I were together for about 18 years, which is also kind of weird because she's gone now 17 years. So she's gone almost as long as we were together. So that feels a little strange. So, what Ben's going to be addressing tonight is this idea of resilience and getting out of the tent and into the woods and re-engaging. Um, it really took me quite some time to do that. I would say on the order of years. So I would say to you, the gentleman out there, it's your mileage may vary. Some people, can grieve for a certain period of time. There really is no absolute prescription, of course, as to how long grief lasts or bereavement lasts. And I would get into the question of what's the difference between grief and depression. And perhaps Ben could speak to that point as well. Um, but I was diagnosed subsequently with what was then called complicated grief. So I found it very difficult to readjust to life without um, my wife. So it took me a long time again, to use tonight's topic and theme, to get out of the tent. So I tended to do everything that you're really not supposed to do, which I isolated myself for quite some time. I kind of lost interest in the things that I normally was very passionate about. Sheila and I love to travel. We were so lucky in that we visited, I don't know, how many different countries that we went to, that we were so fortunate to do our indulge our travel love of travel. I obviously felt it was just too much for me to strike out on my own and fly somewhere on by myself. So I turned to some other things that I thought after a while, and I think I started to feel a little bit better and got re-engaged in music as a guitar player for many years. Uh, Found a band, and that was a wonderful experience to be back in a musical environment. And of course, when you get into a band situation, you usually type sort of like bond with the people, become friends. So that was an added benefit to being in a musical environment. And I got headlong into astronomy. I became passionate about looking at the cosmos. It kind of gave me perspective, an unknown perspective. It's an unanswerable question about where we fit in the scheme of this universe and the cosmos. But it was a thrill to sort of like get a telescope and to look at some of these distant objects in the sky that included other galaxies and, of course, the planets within our own solar system. And eventually I wound up getting involved in the Princeton University astronomers. So made some friends over there, which I'm very grateful for as well. So fortunately, I had quite a few things that I was really interested in, that I could indulge the passion. Um, and that helped me get out of the tent a bit. Um, so that I say, and um, being involved with the National Widowers Organization, I'm obviously doing that in Sheila's memory to help other bereaved guys that have lost their wives, their spouse, um, their best friend, their partner. Um, so I guess all this is by way of saying that it's a long, difficult road. For Sheila and I, there was no plan B. We were just there for each other. We didn't have children because when Sheila was initially diagnosed, she was on rounds, as I mentioned, of chemo, which sent her into chemically induced menopause. So we basically were there for each other. And we had no plan B. So when she passed, I had no plan B. It took a while, but I did find the path. And it's certainly, again, to kind of go back to what I was saying initially, it's difficult this time of year still, even though it's been 17 years, it still sometimes feels like 17 minutes sometimes. Um, and again, it's this time of year that's both a wonderful time because it's the season that she and I got married, and it's a horrible time because it's also the season where we lost her. So I'm still in touch with her wonderful family. I love my in-laws, and we keep in touch. So I'm blessed with that. And it also put me on a mission to try to seek greater truths and to delve into philosophy and doing a bunch of reading on that. So again, I suppose if there's a point to what I'm saying here, I hope I'm not rambling too much, but it's a difficult, impossible sometimes road, impossible to figure out in terms of why this could happen and how did it happen and was there more that I could do? And of course, there's the self-recrimination that sometimes we might feel with that. Some of you gentlemen might be familiar with that whole self-recrimination aspect of losing a partner. But in the end, we hit what's pitched and we do the best we can. And we go forward. So I hope you gentlemen are finding likewise that you're able to move forward. And at this point, I'd like to reintroduce our guest for tonight, Ben Wolfe, and I'm handing it over to you, Ben. So take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ken. First of all, again, I'm sorry about Sheila's death. And as you said, it's been 17 years, and yet it's quote unquote like yesterday, in terms of her death. Um, you did a remarkable job of sort of sharing with us, and I appreciate and thank you for that, about the details behind what took place. And one of the things I think that for all of us, it reminds us again about how we lock in all of those details. You have your details of what you remember for that first year or for all those other years and what it must have been like to watch Sheila run that 26.2 miles. I congratulate her over and over again. I'm a 19-year half marathoner. I'm 77 years old. And this summer was, again, it's really fun because now I'm in the 75 to 80 bracket. There was 12 of us out of 9,500. So the older I get, if I'm still alive and I can still run, I might have a better chance of moving up. But when I think of Sheila in terms of, as you said, your involvement with the men's organization and other things, it's sort of that legacy. It's keeping her alive in so many ways in that regard. It also reminds me of that whole idea about, when people are not here, physically, they're still here. Their presence is still with us all the time, all the time. And that gets back to what Dennis Kloss and Phyllis Silverman. Phyllis, in fact, was the one that started the Widow to Widow program in Boston many, many years ago. She died a number of years ago, but she was talking about, and Dennis, continuing bonds. And I think most of the men probably have heard that term, but continuing bonds is just that. It's the fact that they continue with us, those who have died, for the rest of our life. If I can use an easy example, just think of basically a mobile. My mother's been dead now for well over 50 years, but she was once upon a time, and she still is, on my mobile. My father, who's been dead for a long, long time, is on my mobile. I've got a sister, I've got a brother, and then there's me. I'm the third in the family. Of course, without a doubt, Ken, my parents loved me the best. There was never a question about that. But even though my mother has died for all these years, when I look at that mobile and I think, okay, where do people fit on it? Well, when she died, she was not cut off the mobile, but her weight got lighter. When my dad died, he was not cut off the mobile, his weight got lighter. But as you said, this coming month, well, right now it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And again, the fact of coming up soon is the anniversary of her death. These are the times in all of our lives when we have events, special events, whatever they may be, when you contact with your in-laws or their family members. That's where that weight now starts to get a little bit heavier. Again, some people say, well, they've died, so they're cut off the mobile. And I would totally disagree. But I do feel strongly that as events take place in our life, for the rest of our life, those weights on certain times will get heavier. But after a while, during that event or shortly after, they start to recede again and get a little bit lighter. And it isn't that their goal is to get them off the mobile, but in fact, to be able to appreciate that they are there with us forever. When when I use that talk about get out of the tent, the story behind it is I live, as I've shared with you, Ken, my wife, her name is Barry, it's a boy's name. She was named after, her name was after her grandmother's maiden name. So that's how she's received in the mail, she received draft notices and everything else, way back when. But we live out in the woods and we like to kayak and canoe. And many years ago, we took our canoes, our kayaks, our 16 footers out to what's called Voyageurs National Park, sort of the Canadian-Minnesota border. And for those of us, and those of you who are watching who have kayaked and you go out for 5, 6, 7 days, you take everything with you. You've got your tent, you've got your food, you've got everything you need, and you stuff it in and stuff it in some more. So off we went. We've kayaked on the big lake on Lake Superior where there's times that Barry would see me and then I'd disappear, and she'd see me and I'd disappear in the lake. And so here we are on Voyageurs National Park, and the sky is turning a little bit dark, but we've got a couple hour paddle ahead of us. We finally arrive at a small little island, and it's getting late in the day now, and we find ourselves getting ready to have dinner. So we have dinner and the sky is getting darker, and the mosquitoes, by the way, lots of mosquitoes. This is Minnesota. I mean, they're huge, all right, during certain times of the year. So we pack up our utensils. I mean, in terms of our dishes, we clean them all up, and just starting to rain now. So we quickly get into the tent and make sure we pull that zipper down for the mosquito net. And there we are. And it comes down in buckets. It is raining and it is raining. And we're inside reading with our headlamps. And then next thing I know, I fall asleep. It's about 2:30 in the morning. And Barry, my wife, wakes me up and says, "Do you have to pee?" And I said, "No, no, no, I don't. You go ahead, go out." She says, "No, no, you do have to pee. You're coming with me." Like, oh man, I'm warm, I'm comfortable. It was just pouring down with rain. I don't want to get out here, let alone the mosquitoes. You're coming with me. Okay. So we open the mosquito net of the tent, go outside, and there was a moon that was so full it was going to explode. The stars were magnificent. And we just sat there after each of us took our pee and ended up sort of just spent some time appreciating what we would have missed. That became just sort of for myself, and as you shared before a little bit, about getting out of the tent. That metaphor about all of us in our lives are we can stay and be passive, or we can do things that are active. And I think again, I'm fortunate. We live in the woods. We can go today. We went for a couple-mile walk. Ironically, we saw somebody today. Usually we don't, a couple of days at a time, we don't see people. But it is about getting out. It's about taking a chance to do something that maybe one hasn't done before. As you shared, you got back into your music, you got back into doing astronomy, you started to do some things, but they took a while. As you said, you were clinically, you went in for some support, and you got some support, and that was great. Some men tend to not go in for support, and they don't need to, and some women don't need to either. You know, we find ourselves, that word resilience, what so often George Bonanno talks about resilience, that many times people are strong and find themselves are able to adapt and get through trauma and crisis events without needing additional support, without. And that's fine. But what he also says, and what others have talked about, is because people find themselves often being so resilient, they do not have post-traumatic growth. So oftentimes people who end up maybe aren't not quite as resilient tend to be in a situation where, in fact, as time goes on, they find themselves developing some new paths in their life that they maybe wouldn't have before. They start getting into new relationships, new groups of people they hang out with, that men's support group, going out to do things for a weekend, taking part in activities, learning how to cook, learning how to parent, whatever it may end up being. But they find themselves improving some of these interpersonal relationships. They find themselves also, this post-traumatic growth has to do with sort of a sense of strength. You know, boy, like you said, when Sheila was around, you did things as a team. Barry and I do things as a team. We find ourselves, again, something she's very, very, very good at, and I'm still learning. Other things, it may be the reverse. But it's that idea of sort of, as you said, how do you move forward? That's that type of strength that's there. Another thing sort of that's talked about in post-traumatic growth is the idea of a greater appreciation for life. I've always said, I learned this when I was doing therapy for 30 years. I would see people come into my office, and as a client or as a patient on the floor, if I was visiting people, and they just never lived life. And I saw this quote, it said, live life, don't pass through it. And, we're here only once. We're only here once. And so I think part of that experience, again, is also, for some people, it's a spiritual development too. It doesn't mean they become religious. It doesn't mean they run away from their religion, but it's an opportunity for them to reassess where they are, what it may mean for them along the way. So some people, like I said, are extremely resilient and tend not to need additional support, but those often are the same ones that have found that they don't necessarily have the same growth after as people who often reach out as a strength, reach out for support, whether it's men's groups. I very much thank you and appreciate the story you just shared with all of us. It's not an easy story. It reminds things and pushes buttons on you. And for many of the men, I'm assuming that will be watching this, it will push buttons on them too. Whether it was with breast cancer, whether it was a stroke, whether it was a car accident, whether it was homicide, whether it was somebody died by suicide, whatever it may end up being, we each have our own buttons. We get pushed, we have our own stories. And, if I were to ask people to mark down who are the most important people in their lives, who are the four most important people? Well, geez, I don't know how do I make that decision? But the thing that's important is those people are the most important in their life. They're not in my life, they're in their life. So that idea about resilience is important. The other thing, as I mentioned about continuing bonds, you described it clearly. She's still with you. Sheila's still with you. My mother is, I wish she could have experienced my experiences, that I've had throughout my life, or my dad the same. Those opportunities that we have, we sometimes think that, oh, they'll be there tomorrow. They'll be there the day after. As you said, you and Sheila had a plan A, but it was hard to think about a plan B. And I'm hoping that that's one of the things that, from your comment tonight, to how hopefully all of us need to appreciate that there is going to be a plan B. The question is, are we willing to sort of start exploring it now, have conversations now, and when the time comes, be proactive and take some chances? Because being active in one's grief is what helps people move forward. If anybody at all that sits home and waits for the phone to ring, and then when it rings, they don't pick it up, or when somebody says, let's go out to eat, I don't know, or let's go and do something, I don't know. I've I've been involved all these years. I've run kids groups since 1983. I found myself, leading the homicide group or suicide group but the adult group, for seniors in particular, I'm going to use an example of a fellow. His name was Fred. Fred's wife had died, and Fred, while she was alive, always wanted to go overseas and especially go to Ireland. And she was just frightened of traveling, just did not want to travel, didn't want to travel at all. So because of that, because he loved her, he didn't travel either. After her death, he didn't quite know what to do. He had this yearning to go to Ireland. He talked to his priest and said, I don't know. I feel like I feel guilty. That term existential guilt again for what we feel we should or should not have done, etc. And he felt that I don't know what to do. And the priest very gently said to him, you're still alive. Take advantage of your time. He went to Ireland with a group of people. He had a fabulous time. And that again is about that post-traumatic growth that was talked about. I want to just read one thing. Um, you may know the name, many of you may know the name, and others may not, but his name was Ira Nurkin. And Ira was a lawyer in New York. He had been married for a very, very short time, um, a matter of months with his wife. And she was killed by a drunk driver in the morning on the way to work. And he then sort of became involved in this grief stuff and ended up starting a support group for widowed persons, widow and widowers. But I just want to read two paragraphs, he said, which really, really is a reminder about the core, as he would talk about when people die in our lives, they're still a part of us, as I said. And what he would say, what he did say, is that after a death, we don't lose everything. We still have those values. We still have our belief systems. We still have our relationships. And as he said here, quote, I spent my first anniversary alone. He was 35 years old. He was a Washington lawyer whose wife was killed in a car accident 5 months after their marriage. We just bought a house, and suddenly all of our plans were shot. We never had a chance to live out our dreams. He went on, the pain of Pauline's death has not entirely faded, and I don't expect it ever will. But with almost every passing day, more of my emptiness and despair is translated into hope. Life is different and much more difficult than it would have been had Pauline lived. But I am infinitely enriched by her life having touched mine, and I am determined to find all the love, excitement, and joy my wife would wish for me. I write this, he says, I hear her applauding. And I think, Ken, that's what you were talking about is sort of this legacy of doing things to benefit others, a way a tribute to her, as a way a tribute to Sheila, and some of the ideas about opening doors, taking chances, that post-traumatic growth again, to do things that maybe we wouldn't have done because we weren't in that situation. So maybe I'll just close here. And I know you've got a couple of questions, and we've only got about 10 minutes, but maybe address some of them or go from there. Ken?
Sure. Well, we have a couple of questions that have come in. Um, Person wants to know, how do you know when it's time to get out of the tent?
Well, I think that's an important thing because each of us, it'll be different. When I've done this for a long time, I've had a lot of thousands of people that I've had the opportunity and the gift to work with. And I think of a man in particular whose wife died and had two kids. all right, young kids, 9 years of age at the time. And he ended up with so busy, and this is something that everybody who has kids in particular, if they become a widower and they have kids, especially young kids, they're so busy as a widow is, so busy to keep the kids active, to keep them in soccer, to keep them this, to keep them that, to make sure they get to dance class or ballet class. And so they're running around, getting them there all the time. And the support system around them, whether it's church, synagogue, mosque, whether they're not involved at all in those areas, their friends, they're so glad to see them be active that they start to pull away. Well, guess what? 6 months goes by, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, the first year goes by, and then people say, well, geez, it's already been a year. Instead of saying it's only been a year.
Right.
All right. Um, so it could be 15 months. It could be longer down the road where somebody says, now that the kids are getting organized and I've got them into a support group or some kind of a social network, I'm finding myself, I don't know what to do. And that's when many of them will be reaching out. So to be able to say, here's the time you should do it, it really is whatever. If somebody is feeling that I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I'm not socially being involved, I'm drinking too much, I'm smoking too much dope, I'm just finding myself in the house all the time. I'm not picking up that phone. I'm not going for a walk in the woods or just looking for birds outside or taking the camera with me to take pictures of what gives me hope. Um, then it's time to sort of try to seek out some support, try to seek out some help. But to be able to say to somebody, you should, my favorite line I hope people will walk away with is I always tell people, don't let anybody should on you and don't should on yourself, because you will find people who have never been in your shoes. Even if they have been, it's not their shoes are not your and Sheila's shoes or my family shoes. We're all different. So for each person, I think they need to assess, could I knock on a door of a counselor? Could I knock on the door of a therapist? Or just go to a friend's house and just talk? Go
Right.
for a walk, go for a run. I'm a runner, but I like to run alone. But today, here we are in the woods, went for a couple-mile walk. Yes, it's my wife. I'm like you, wondering about plan B. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I've done this
Mm,
therapist stuff forever. In
mm,
fact, one time I was at home on the computer. It was a Thursday night, working really hard, and Barry, my wife, was in the other room reading. And then all of a sudden, she came into the room when I was on the computer. She waited till I was finished. And I said, what is it? And she says, well, I've been reading this book, and there's a question in here that I want to ask you. And I said, well, what's the question? And she said, is our relationship based on obligation or opportunity? Is our relationship based on obligation or opportunity? I said, that's a really good question, Barry. What do you think? And she, of course, came back with, don't give me that therapist shit. I want to know what you think. And I think if we think about this for men in particular, right now, how do they perceive what they may want to do? Is it opportunities to do things to open new doors to sort of that post-traumatic growth? Or do they feel that there is, obligations, which we do have obligations to a degree. There's no doubt about it. So again, hoping that when's the right time to seek support? Anytime at all is the right time. You can always knock on a door, and if somebody says, you seem like you're doing well, that's good. That's reinforcing. But if they also say, you tell me, are you coping differently now than you did when you had a crisis before? And they say, no, I'm still using my church. I'm still using my friends. I'm still doing things. Well, it seems then that they'd be coping in a pretty, I'll use the word healthy way, versus someone that's out spending money they don't have, doing a lot of things that they know are not helpful, even though they may feel like they're filling in some of the emptiness.
Right. That's negative coping. Yeah.
Yep.
I think we have time maybe for one more question here, Ben. Uh,
Okay.
what would you define as taking chances after the death of a spouse? What would be like a door opener for that?
Well, I think first of all, somebody's got to ask the question of themselves, am I am I healthy with who I am? Do I have meaning and purpose in my life? Can I do things on my own, or do I feel like I have to have a partner to fill my life? All right. Those are things that, different ages. I can end up, as I have over the years, it could be a 28-year-old whose wife died, could be a 35-year-old, or it could be an 80-year-old or a 90-year-old. So we are in different places in our life. Some people end up that same gentleman that I started talking about, whose wife died and had the young kids. He started to date again, and he started to have a relationship. His kids were only sort of seven, I think it was 7 and 9 or 6 and 9. And he really loved this woman. And one night she came over to the house, knocked on the door. The oldest son said to her as she walked in, "I just want you to know that dad is dating somebody else too." Well, he just, she didn't know what to do. So she finally addressed the elephant in the room and said to the fellow that she'd been going with for months and months, and this was a strong relationship. She said, "Is it true?" He said, "No, no, no." And again, the 9-year-old is trying to sabotage what was going on.
Hmm.
So you find that different people are willing to get into new relationships. They may take a while, they may not, but it's a matter of, sometimes people will say a chapter two or a new beginning, whatever it may be. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be with a partner. It can end up at least starting out with taking chances, learning about oneself, doing some journaling, going for those walks, being active socially in some way, volunteering at the food shelf or something else, just to get out of the tent, to get out of the tent. We can lock ourselves into a house and just not get out at all. But getting out, taking chances, we not only gain new relationships in that post-traumatic growth, but we learn a lot more about ourselves and the gifts that are there too. Let me just share one last thing before we do close up, Ken.
Sure.
Was in ironically, Kubler-Ross's book when it first came out. It's a fellow, Moami Amara, he said, and I quote, "Abandoning old ways and breaking old patterns is like dying. At least dying to old ways of life for an unknown new life of meaning and relationships. But living without change is not living at all. Dying is a precondition for living. Growth is a precondition for living. To limit the process is to exist as compressed beings." So I think, again, he didn't say it, but I'm saying get out of the tent. Get out of the tent, get involved, be proactive at doing things, and just, our life, it's going to end at some point. And we might as well enjoy it as best we can, as meaningful as we can, to support others, to support our environment, and just to be healthy in a good way. So again, I want to thank you, Ken. I want to thank the network for what it does over the years. And to all of you men out there, thank you for listening. And I hope that you will take that next step, get out of the tent, and in turn, be somebody different than who you were once upon a time.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ben. It's been a great conversation, and your insights were amazing. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. We want you to know that you're not alone, and always feel free to reach out to us. If you want more info, email us or check out our websites, nationalwidowers.org and mensgriefnetwork.org, where you'll find many resources and links to this and other podcasts available on our YouTube channel. Join us on the last Wednesday of every month for our podcasts at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Next month, our podcast will be dealing with a big one, dealing with the holidays. If you missed any part of tonight's podcast, would like to watch it again or send the link to a friend or loved one, the links are posted on the Men's Grief Network website, the MGN Facebook page, and the Men's Grief Network YouTube channels. You can also watch all past podcasts on the Men's Grief Network YouTube channel. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, email us at info@nationalwidowers.org and check out our sites at mensgriefnetwork.org and nationalwidowers.org. We depend on your feedback to serve you better, so please keep in touch and let us know what you'd like to see more of or less of. And if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. That really helps us get the word out to other widowers, and hit the bell to be alerted to all upcoming NWO podcasts. Thanks so much again, Ben. I'm your host, Ken Levy. Take good care of yourselves, and good night.